A little while after I got my mossy frogs, my sister got a leopard gecko. She asked me to set up an enclosure for her, so that's exactly what I'm going to do. Her previous owners told us she was perfectly healthy, but we're not quite sure. We think she's either overweight or carrying eggs as she's been acting defensive lately. If there are any leopard gecko experts in the comments, please let me know what you think. Anyway, on with the project. To start, I'm using a 25-gallon Exoterra. Normally I'd make my own custom tank, but we already had this one and decided to just go with it. As usual, the first thing to do is make the background. I measured the back of the tank to know how big to cut the foam. You've probably seen me do this process enough by now, but this one's going to be a tiny bit different. I'm going for a bit more of a 3D background with hides and flat rocks to climb on. It'll make a bit more sense later. After cutting the foam, I drew on my design with a Sharpie. Halfway through drawing the first design, I realized I wasn't happy with it and started from scratch. I'm going to carve parts of this background in different portions, as I'll need to account for hides like I said earlier. Anyway, the next few steps are like usual, with carving the background with a knife and adding texture with a wire brush drill bit. The texture I'm going for this time is not like rocks or wood, but more of stacked slate stones. I also added a few other pieces of foam onto the background to make areas that stick out more. Before I move on with the carving, I need to make the first hide. To start, I cut a bunch of shapes of foam that can be assembled to make a sort of cave. The first part of this process is a bit confusing, but it'll all make sense a little bit later. This first piece will be the top of the hide, while the next pieces will be the sides. To make the sides, I carved an angle on top and a flat part on the bottom. Like I said, this process is a bit confusing to start, but what I'm doing here is carving a variety of 2D shapes that can be assembled into one 3D shape. After cutting out the first side, I split the top into two pieces and carved this one so I could attach the other piece at an angle. Then I marked for which pieces attached to which so it could be assembled easier later. Next I need to make the other side. You can see a bit more how I carved the first side by laying down the top and drawing on the design. Same as the last one, it's angled on the top and flat on the bottom. After everything was cut and assembled, I could mark for where to carve on the foam. Here you can see the background all put together, but I'll carve it to add texture later. The reason I marked the foam was so that I had a flat surface to attach it to. Next I'm going to make a sort of staircase using foam to make it look like slates. Again, this process is a bit confusing to start, but will all make sense later. What I did here was carve a variety of different shapes and layered them on top of one another to create a natural looking staircase. Like I did with the hide, I marked which pieces attached to which so it'd be easier to assemble later. After the first two pieces were done, I continued to make the rest. After cutting the last piece of foam, I assembled it, marked on the background like before, and started to add texture again. Here you can see that I'm carving around the outlines, making sure to leave them flat so the hide and stairs will attach better. This wire brush drill bit has been such a help when adding texture, as it gives me a much better texture and cuts down the time it takes by a lot. After I got done carving it, I went to test fit the background and realized it wouldn't fit in one piece. Luckily there was already a score down the middle of the foam, so I could easily snap it in half. Everything fit perfect now, so I could move on to attach the hide. Before I do that though, I need to assemble the hide itself. To do so, I'm using hot glue. I found it's the best glue to use for this, as super glue doesn't dry fast enough and it doesn't stick as well. Also, you can see here this is where marking the pieces comes in handy, as I know which piece is attached to which. I repeated the process with the stairs and attached them both to the background pieces. Next I need to make the other two hides. Leopard geckos are supposed to have 3 hides, 1 on the hot side and 2 on the cold side, one of which having damp sphagnum moss or cocoa fiber to make it easier to shed. I again started by carving a variety of 2D pieces and assembling them in a way that creates a 3D shape. You can see that I made it in almost a T pattern, with one facing one way while the other facing the opposite direction. After permanently attaching the other 2 pieces, I started to carve the structures. This was a little more difficult than carving the actual background, as this isn't a completely flat surface. I also added a few more steps towards the bottom and took out the other hides so I could carve them easier. I then reattached the hides and started to carve the main one. This was a bit of a tricky process, but I eventually got it done. Once everything was carved, I sealed it all up with a hairdryer set to hot. After all of that, I can finally move on to painting. Like usual, I'll be using Drylock, colored with concrete pigments. I applied this in the usual way, with a thick base coat followed by progressively lighter dry brush coats. Once everything had been painted and had time to dry, I could attach it to the tank. I started by wiping down the back with rubbing alcohol to remove debris, and then applying silicone. Then I set the background pieces in and pressed them firmly into place. You'll see I did this in a few different parts, as everything wouldn't fit in one piece. Luckily I was able to fit the right piece in with the stairs intact, but the hide on the left side had to be placed in separate. To make everything look more cohesive, I added silicone in all of the corners and painted it with Drylock. Now everything's finished, and I have to say this was one of the more complicated builds I've done. While I'm very happy with the final result, I feel there's areas I could have made less flat. Now onto the false bottom. I debated whether this was necessary or not, and came to the conclusion that although there will be little to no water in this tank, the plants will need to be watered about once a month, so it won't hurt to add an area for the water to collect. That being said, I won't need much, just a small layer of egg crate will do just fine. Because I didn't know if I would need a false bottom or not, I didn't plan ahead, so unfortunately it didn't fit in one piece. I had to cut it into a bunch of little strips, but it still fits and will work just fine. I also added a piece of mesh to keep the substrate and false bottom separate. It was a bit of a hassle getting the mesh in here, but eventually I got it. Next thing to do is to mix up the substrate. I went with a 1:1 ratio of sand and cocoa fiber. The reason for no reptile bark is so there's nothing too big for her to get impacted, and the reason for no sphagnum moss is so that it doesn't retain humidity as well. After all, leopard geckos do need an arid climate with humidity levels of 30 to 40%. After all the substrate was added, it was time to add the plants. I'm using exclusively succulents as they'll only need to be watered once a month, which will help keep the humidity down. As usual, I removed them from their pots and broke up the soil from the roots. Then I rinsed off the remaining soil. To address heating and lighting, we're using a Zoom-Ed under tank heater attached to the side of the tank, a UVB bulb, and a ceramic heater attached to a thermostat. Anyway, after all the plants were rinsed off, I could start adding them to the tank. You'll see here that there's a piece of wood in the tank. I decided to remove that later because it just didn't fit. This was a bit of a harder tank to plant because I didn't have much room and a lot of the plants were a lot shorter, so it was harder to cover more space. I also added a few mounds of dirt in the corners so I could put plants up there. In hindsight, I probably should have just added pots, but this worked pretty well. After all was said and done, we ended up with something that I think looks pretty cool. It's definitely not my best work, but for the amount of time and money that we had to work with, I'd say it's pretty good. I want to add some more plants in the future, like air plants to the background, but unfortunately we couldn't find any. Let me know what you think about this build down in the comments. Anyway, that's all I got for you today. Thanks for watching.